Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. You're all very welcome to join this Girls Not Brides webinar. We have a number of participants on the line from the UK, US, Cameroon, Pakistan, Nepal, Turkey, Kenya, Nigeria, Girls Not Brides members and partners who are all united in our commitment to end child marriage. We are here today, of course, to discuss the new numbers about the global scope of child marriage. We know that UNICEF launched these new figures in July at the Girls Summit, which focused on child marriage and FGM. And it's an opportunity today for us to understand where the new figures come from, what's particularly new and surprising about them. And also we know that the next year is a critical period for our international and regional advocacy efforts, with the post-2015 development agenda being negotiated, with the African Union campaign on child marriage being developed, to name but a few. And there are other opportunities for advocacy, both in countries affected and regionally and globally. And we know that members and partners will find it helpful in highlighting the global scope of the problem. So it's a timely opportunity for us to reflect with members and partners about what the implications are for our collective messaging about the global scope of child marriage and the latest trends. So to give you an introduction to the panelists that we have with us today, Claudia Kappa is a statistics specialist in the data and analytics section at UNICEF headquarters. She is the focal point for data collection, data analysis, and methodological work on early childhood development, child disability, and child protection from violence, exploitation, and abuse, including FGMC and child marriage. We have Anita Raj, a professor of medicine and global public health and the director of the Center on Gender Equity and Health at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Raj is a development psychologist and has over 20 years of experience researching sexual and reproductive health, adolescent health, HIV/AIDS, and gender-based violence. She's written extensively on the issue of girl-child marriage, with particular expertise on trends in South Asia. Anne Warner is Senior Gender and Youth Specialist at the International Center for Research on Women, where she leads research and advocacy projects that empower women and young people, especially adolescent girls in the developing world. She's over 14 years of experience developing programs, conducting research, and advocating for the health and human rights of women and youth, with a special focus on child marriage, sexual reproductive health, and girls' education. And finally, we have Laura Dickinson, the communications lead at Girls Not Brides. And Laura works in the Girls Not Brides Secretariat to bring the issue of child marriage to global attention, to raise the profile of members' work to address the practice, and to work with members to develop collective messages to support policy and advocacy work. And my name is Ellen Travers, and I'm the Programme Officer with the Girls Not Brides Secretariat and the facilitator of this webinar today. What we'll do is start with a presentation from Claudia Kappa about the numbers and what's new about what we're hearing. And then we'll have an opportunity to ask her a few questions, as well as having a discussion with the panel. And we'll open it up to questions from you as well. So you'll have an opportunity to ask questions after about 20-30 minutes. But if you already have questions as the presentation goes along, you can insert them into the questions box, and we'll pick them up and note them and make sure that we address them. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Claudia for her presentation.
Thank you, Ellen. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I would like to start by thanking the organizer for giving UNICEF the opportunity to present the latest statistics on the issue of child marriage. As you may know, UNICEF has the mandate within the United Nations system, to maintain a global database on child marriage using different indicators. UNICEF is involved also in the collection of data on child marriage through the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, which is a UNICEF-supported program that helps countries gather relevant information on the situation of children and women, mostly in low and middle-income countries. The mixed surveys, together with the DHS survey, the demographic and health surveys, are the main sources of data on child marriage in low and middle-income countries. So as Helen mentioned, these data were first presented by UNICEF at the Girls Summit that took place in July. And this is just a short overview of our recent calculations. Let's start by looking at the current situation. According to UNICEF's latest estimate, more than 700 million women of all ages alive today in the world were first married or in union during their childhood, specifically before the age of 18. And 1 in 3 of these child brides were married before they even reached the age of 15. For the first time, we have been able to produce a global figure that does not focus on a specific age group, but look at the magnitude of the problem by focusing on all women who are alive today and the number of those who were married in their childhood. It's also the first time that we have been able to produce a global estimate for men. And as you can see in this graph, the differences in the numbers and the proportion are striking. 156 million men, again, of all ages alive today in the world were married in their childhood, compared to more than 700 million. When I say global estimate, it's important to remember that UNICEF follows certain important statistical criteria to define when estimates can be considered global. Now, we have data in our database for more than 150 countries. And we use the country data to come up with regional and global estimates. But we only release global and regional estimates if we have sufficient population coverage. Now, going to looking at the distribution of this child bride, as we all know, almost half of the child brides worldwide alive today live in Asia, in South Asia specifically. And 1 in 3 of these women are Indian. So India represents 33% of all child brides in the world, and South Asia is 42%, followed by East Asia and the Pacific. Obviously, it's also due to the large size of the women population in that region. Now, in terms of proportions, again, South Asia is the top region with more than 50% of women, and we're talking here about adult women aged 20 to 49 who were first married or in union before the age of 18. And as you can see, what is also important to highlight in the case of South Asia, we have a significant proportion of women who were first married by age 15. As you can see from the graphs, it's about 25% of women in South Asia. Worldwide, we have an overall prevalence of child marriage of 29%, with the problem being mostly concentrated in least developed countries, where more than half of the population of women, again, adult women, were first married or in union before the age of 18. Now, let's go quickly into the trends. Let's look at what has happened in the last 30 years. And again, these estimates that I'm about to present are estimates that have been produced by UNICEF because we finally had sufficient country data to generate global and regional figures. There are different ways in which we can look at trends. One way, which is the simpler way and the weakest way, would be to compare the prevalence of child marriage across 2 points in time by looking at 2 different surveys. However, this is a particularly weak way of looking at trends. Why? Because between survey rounds, there might be differences due to sample design or difference due to implementation issues. And also, in many cases, when we look at an issue like child marriage, it is important to look at a longer period of time, because child marriage, it is a demographic issue, if you want. It follows certain demographic patterns. So looking at two surveys that have been conducted over 5 years of time, for instance, is not a very powerful way of looking at the trends when it comes to child marriage. So a better way of looking at trends is comparing the prevalence of child marriage across cohort of women of different ages on the basis of data coming from a given survey at one point in time. And this is exactly what the graphs show. For convenience, we have presented the data so that you can see historically over a period going from 1985 to 2010, how the prevalence of child marriage has declined. So overall, the practice is declining, especially when it comes to marriages under the age of 15. The decline has been slow, as you can see from this graph. So it has not been a drastic decline. Again, these are global figures. So I'm going to give you in a second the perspective at the regional level. So in 1985, the prevalence of child marriage was about 33% among girls that at the time were 20-24. And this compared to 26% of girls aged 20-24 in 2010. Now, let's look quickly at the data by region. So we have presented here the 7 UNICEF regions. And as we can see in the graph, over the same period of time, regions have followed different patterns when it comes to the prevalence of child marriage. The Middle East of North Africa has made the fastest progress in reducing the child marriage prevalence. Obviously, the levels were much lower, even in 1985, than what we can see in South Asia. The prevalence was practically half, more or less, of what it was in South Asia in 1985. But the prevalence of child marriage in the region of Middle East or North Africa in 2010 went below 20%. So when I say that this was the fastest progress, obviously we are talking about a reduction, a proportionate reduction, given the starting point, the starting level in Middle East and South Africa. South Asia has also recorded a decline. That is obviously important because of the size of the population affected in South Asia. But as you can see from this graph, the decline in South Asia has been particularly sharp starting from 2000. So it's something that has mostly taken place, or it has accelerated during the last 10 years. And lastly, I would like you to have specifically to focus on Latin America and the Caribbean. Over a period of practically 25 years, the prevalence of child marriage in the region of Latin America and Caribbean has been stable. One thing I need to specify, though, when women are asked this question within the context of household survey like Mix and DHS, they are asked their age, the first time they got married, or they started living together with a man as if married. So this covers, this indicator covers formal and informal unions, which are very relevant within the context of Latin America and the Caribbean. Again, these are regional data. The situation at the country level is very different, even within regions. And I'll give quickly the example of Sub-Saharan Africa. In this continent, the continent of Sub-Saharan Africa, we can see that in countries like Ethiopia, over the same period of time, the median age at marriage has increased by 3 years among women. In Sub-Saharan Africa, at the same time, in a country like Burkina Faso, for instance, that has recorded important progress in other harmful traditional practices, like, for instance, female genital mutilation and cutting, the median age at marriage has remained constant without any improvement over the same period of time, where other progress has been recorded in other important areas of women empowerment. In my last couple of slides, I would like to share with you the projected figures for child marriage going forward. When providing projections and targets on child marriage as well as on other topics, it is important to take into consideration three different elements: current levels of the practice, the trends that we observed in the past, and the demographic projection when it comes to the population of women. So all these three elements need to be included in the model that will generate projected figure. When doing so, this is how the situation with respect to child marriage looks like. As I said earlier, today in the world, there are more than 700 million, to be precise, 720 million women of all ages alive today worldwide that were first married on a union before age 15. Before age 18. So if the prevalence of child marriage that exists today remains constant, meaning remains at today's level, this is what's going to happen to the 720 million. This is the first line in dark red. This number will go up to 1.2 billion. So if the prevalence remains at the level recorded today, the number of married girls, the number of child brides will go up to 1.2 billion. Why? Because the population of women in the most affected countries and in the largest countries will continue to grow. If we are able to replicate the decline that we have observed over the last 25 years, and that I showed to you earlier in my slide, the number will remain constant. This is the gray line. So the number of women today at 720 will be around 710 by 2050. This means that the rate of decline we observed in the last 25 years, if replicated between now and 2050, will only be enough to contrast the population growth, but it will not be sufficient to generate a decline in the number of women that were married before age 15. For us to be able to see a decline in the number, progress has to be accelerated. In other words, our rate of decline going forward has to be higher than the rate of growth of the population of women. The good news is this decline is within reach. Why? Because we have seen that in the last 10 years, the decline has accelerated. So if the acceleration that we witnessed in the last 10 years, particularly in regions like South Asia, is replicated going forward and sustained throughout 2050, we are going to be able to reduce the number of women affected by the practice. And this is essentially the same graph, but looking at the proportions. The previous graph looked at the global numbers, this looking at the proportion. So the levels of child marriage currently stand at 26% for girls aged 20 to 24. So if the observed decline continues, this 26% will become 18% in 2050. And if progress is accelerated, the prevalence of child marriage among the youngest generation of women, 2024, will go from 26% to 11% in 2050. And this is the last slide. It's also important to look at projections by region. And this is what the data are telling us. With the three different scenarios, the prevalence remains at today's level, the observed decline continues, and the progress is accelerated. And these different colors represent the number of women, the number of child brides, depending on the three scenarios by region. And what I would like you to look at is the situation with respect to sub-Saharan Africa. Because of demographic trends, sub-Saharan Africa, regardless of the scenario that we are going to be able to accomplish, is going to have the largest number and global share of child brides by 2050. If progress is accelerated, if the observed decline continues, South Asia will lose the top position in terms of global number and share of child brides. And why? Because in South Asia, no matter the level of progress we're going to be able to achieve, the population of women will be declining. And because of that, this will help contrast the prevalence of child marriage. I'm going to stop here. I would like to thank you for your attention. And I would like to highlight the website, data.unicef.org, where you will find our global database on child marriage and all relevant publication on this issue. I'm going to be happy to respond to any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia, for an excellent and really informative presentation. We've already had a number of questions that have come up, one quite closely linking to the last point that you made. You know, we know at the moment that almost half of all child brides worldwide live in South Asia. Do we know what proportion at the moment of child brides are African? That's to say Africa as a whole versus West and Central Africa on the one hand and East and Southern Africa on the other hand. So do we have a sense of those numbers? I'll just give you one other question that's come up is the figures don't include more than 50% of the global population. Does that mean that the figures are not global as such? So I'll start with those two questions and come back to you with a few more.
So when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, the levels are about essentially 4 out of 10 women. So the prevalence for sub-Saharan Africa of child marriage before age 18 is around 4 out of 10 women. Now, if we include in the definition of Africa, if we look at Africa as for the whole continent, including Middle East and North Africa, the levels are slightly lower because the North African countries have overall a lower prevalence of child marriage. We use the threshold of 50% as a minimum to report on global and regional estimates. So, and we do so because that's a typical standard statistical threshold for releasing regional and global estimates. When it comes to the overall prevalence of child marriage, currently the population coverage that we have in our database is about 72%, if I remember correctly, which means, and why we use this threshold, exactly because the contribution of this missing country will not be sufficient to dramatically change the overall prevalence. That's why we use as a minimum 50% of coverage, but it doesn't mean that this is a 50%. Depending on the indicators, our coverage will go higher than 50%. And in some cases, we have data for China, for instance, when it comes to the current marital status of girls 15 to 19. And obviously, when China is included in the global estimates, the prevalence, I mean, the population coverage goes to more than 90% for our indicators.
Thank you, Claudia. That's really helpful. I have Two very quick follow-up questions before we move to the panel and a number of other questions. It relates to the numbers that we're using and how we should interpret these. You know, we're hearing that 700 million women alive today have been affected by child marriage. At the same time, we know that 70 million child brides are alive right now. So can you tell us about how these figures are different? And could you also tell us, we understand the figure is 15 million girls are married every year, when we thought that it was 14 million girls getting married every year. Can you talk us through what the implications of these figures are and where these differences come from?
Absolutely, and thanks for this question. It's very important to clarify this issue. 720 million looks at the overall population of adult women, age 18 and above. The number of 70 million represent a subset of these women. 70 million only refers to women who are currently 20 to 24 and were married in their childhood. So the number of 70 million is included in the 720. The reason why we're using the 720 here is that we wanted to really give a sense of the magnitude of how many women alive today were married in childhood. And why we use that approach? Because women have to carry the consequences of child marriage throughout their lives. So it is very important that we really give a sense of how many women have been affected in their lifetime by the issue of child marriage. The reason why sometimes we prefer to report on the prevalence and the numbers for the 2024, because this gives us a sense of the most recent levels of the prevalence. Because a woman who is today 45, she was married and she's reporting about an event that happened to her 30 years ago, more or less, right? If she was married at the age of 15, this is reflect the level of the risk of women 30 years ago. Now, we also need to provide a sense of the risk today, or what we can say, like in the recent past. That's why sometimes we prefer to look at the prevalence among the youngest generation of women, because it gives you a better sense of the most recent levels of the practice. So these numbers are not in contradiction. And it's very important that when we use a number, quote a number, refer to a number, we specify the indicators that we're using. Because for that, we use different indicators for child marriage depending on the argument we want to make. In some cases, we prefer to use the current prevalence among the current marital status, for instance, among girls 15 to 19, if we need to report about the current situation of women. So it depends very much on the argument we want to make. So we choose the indicator that is the most appropriate. That's why it's also very important for the readers to really understand what the data, what the figure, what the estimate is referring to. When it comes to the 14 million versus 15 million, 15 million is just an update. Every year, the population of women is growing. So if I were to calculate the same number that I present to you a year from now, the numbers will go up, because there are girls that are being born every day, and there are girls that are being married every day. So because of the demographic trends, even if we were to have the same levels of the prevalence, the overall burden numbers, which is the overall numbers, will go up. So the 15 compared to the 14 is just an update that take into consideration the most recent population numbers that are released by the United Nations every year.
Thank you, Claudia. That's a really helpful explanation. I'm going to bring in our panelists at this point, and perhaps start with you, Anita. You've done a lot of work looking at the trends of child marriage. Can you talk us through your reactions to this, and what's the impact of these trends in child marriage on other health trends in South Asia?
Yes. So in the work in South Asia, one of the things we've really looked at are some of the maternal and child health consequences of early marriage of girls. And as you would expect, we see quite a bit of vulnerability, both in terms of nutrition and development of infants, but also in terms of their survival and also mothers' ability to engage in reproductive control so that they can make the decision about when they want to have children. So even if you're married, that doesn't mean you have to have children, but in point of fact, the ones who marry as minors are least likely to use contraception and least likely to be able to make that decision of whether or not to contracept on their own. So the issues of reproductive autonomy, the issues of being able to control one's own fertility, and the child health consequences are quite substantial. And so the data seem to suggest that within the context of South Asia, a lot of the inadequate movement on things like infant mortality could really be tied directly to the issue of girl-child marriage. So the fact that the decline is so inadequate, and what is new to me is actually that the highest rates are now being seen in South Asia, because I know a lot of the West and Central African countries have very, very high rates. So this is quite of concern, particularly when you're talking about the numbers in the South Asian region.
Thank you, Anita. Anne, we've heard about the impact that child marriage has on women throughout their lives, and the 720 million figure tells us like the magnitude of the problem, as well as how it doesn't just stop when a girl reaches 18 and can affect them throughout their whole lives. What do the differences in the numbers that we use tell us about how we should work with young women as well as older generations on our work in this area?
Yes, thank you, Ellen, and thanks so much for hosting this webinar. It's been really helpful. I think the numbers that Claudia shared this morning, based on the latest UNICEF report, point to a few interesting programmatic implications for the field. And one that you just alluded to is the fact that child marriage affects girls and women throughout their lives. And so we really need to have tailored, generationally appropriate strategies to reach girls at different points in their development, as well as the older women in their lives, their mothers, grandmothers, and other gatekeepers, and as well as, of course, the men, the boys, the brothers, the potential future spouses of these girls. I think what we've learned from our research and from the experiences of many other groups out there in the world who've been implementing programs on child marriage is that group-based safe space programs that work with girls who are either at risk of early marriage or girls who are already married. These programs can really be powerful sources of information, skills, and social support. And they can help girls to begin to transform their views of themselves, to increase their confidence and self-efficacy, to help support them to seek alternatives to marriage and their domestic responsibilities, and also to influence others in their lives. At the same time, we know girls can't do it alone. As I mentioned earlier, others in their households and communities certainly need to be engaged. And especially when we think about the fact that this data so powerfully points us to that child marriage does affect women throughout their lives, and many of the mothers and fathers of these girls who are at risk of marriage would have been married when they were young, when early marriage was even more the norm for their generation. And while they may want an alternative for their daughters, they also need to be supported in doing that. And finally, I think Claudia alluded to something really important and interesting when she talked about Latin America and the Caribbean, and the fact that informal unions are very important to consider. And it helps challenge us to think about not only the sheer numbers, but also how marriage happens, the meanings that marriage has in different contexts, what the drivers are, and therefore what are the appropriate and promising areas for intervention. Research not only on the numbers, but also some of these other factors can really help us develop more sophisticated, more targeted, and more effective programs in the future.
Thank you, Anne. I'd like to turn to Laura now. Laura, when we talk about the different numbers that we're using, what kind of comparisons can and can't we draw to try and make the data meaningful to a wider audience?
Thanks very much, Ellen. We've heard a lot today, some fascinating and quite startling data. And I think for all of us who are working in the field and who've been familiar with data on this issue for a long time, it's very meaningful to us because we appreciate the scale. We're bought into the idea that this is an issue on a large and global scale. But I think it's very easy for us to overlook how child marriage, how that data isn't readily seen and understood in terms of its scale by a wider audience. Bear with me just one moment as I pull up a slide to talk through some of this. So when we talk about this data, these huge numbers, how do we make this meaningful to our audience?
We seem to be experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties with Laura's connection at the moment. So we'll come back to her on what the implications of how we make the numbers meaningful when we reestablish that connection. In the meantime, I'd like to go to a number of questions that have come up. Right, let's start with one. You mentioned that, and I'll read out a couple of questions and then leave this to other panelists online to comment. You mentioned the decline of the population of women in South Asia in the coming decades. Is this related solely to sex-selective abortions and the preference for sons, or are there other factors also? And also in China, is China in the East Asia category? So that might be one for Claudia. Let's start with that one. and we'll keep an eye on the other questions as they come in.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Now, China, unfortunately, depends a little bit on the indicators. Overall, when it comes to China, for many indicators, unfortunately, we don't have nationally representative data for this country. And obviously, this is a pity because the size of the population of China will make a huge impact on levels. So what we have done in the case of regional figures, when we don't have China within the East Asia and Pacific region, we apply the overall levels that we see in the regions to come up with the regional figures, but it does not include the data for China when it comes to the prevalence of child marriage before age 18. It does include it when it comes to the prevalence or current levels of child marriage among girls 15 to 19, because these data are available from the census, the latest census that took place in China. So we can use these 15 to 19 to extrapolate and have a sense of the overall prevalence of child marriage. So the other question was about South Asian projection going forward, where these are demographic projections. Okay, so the populations going forward is based on a statistical model put together by UN Statistical Division that take into consideration the patterns that have been observed in the last few years and replicate these patterns going forward. So, of course, there are many different factors that can explain the decline of the population in the regions, including the decline in fertility overall that has been witnessed, more access to contraception, more access to education for women, etc. So there might be many different reasons behind the decline in the overall population of South Asia. The decline that we see in the population of South Asia does not only pertain to women. So it pertains to the overall population of women and men in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Another question that's come in is, how do we as researchers respond to and account for the increasing prevalence of child marriage among refugee populations, specifically Syrian refugees who are reporting higher rates of child marriage? And rates globally are declining, but among these high risk and often difficult to reach population, there has in fact been an increase.
Obviously, that's a very important point that we have observed in all contexts of crisis. Even in the case of Haiti, for instance, you can see that the prevalence of child marriage has been changing depending on the different crises the country had to go through. Child marriage is sometimes seen as a sort of protection mechanism, if you want, by many parents. So it is not unusual to see increases in the levels of child marriage from time to time. Obviously, these are relatively small populations. So when it comes to the global numbers, so the big figures, they tend to be, these increases in the levels of child marriage tends to be averaged out by the overall patterns that we can see for the overall population.
Thanks, Claudia. We're going to try and bring Laura back in and see what we can do to talk again about making the numbers meaningful. Laura, over to you.